Welcome back to A Sharper Life. I'm your host, Nikki Sharp, a 2-time best-selling author, wellness expert, and your personal transformation coach. On today's episode, I am thrilled to welcome Caroline Middelsdorf, a psychologist and trauma-informed coach who has built an incredible community of nearly 1 million followers on social media. Caroline is dedicated to helping people move from survival mode to truly thriving, offering guidance on managing anxiety, understanding trauma responses, overcoming people pleasing, and building a healthier relationship with your nervous system. Through her compassionate and insightful content, she's empowering people to break free from old patterns, find inner peace, and navigate the journey of healing with greater self-awareness and resilience. So today's conversation is enlightening, to say the least. We talk about trauma, what it is, and signs to look for if you have trauma. We go over the difference between PTSD and complex trauma, and this will really help you better understand yourself. We dive into people pleasing and why we become people pleasers starting from a young age. She gives a really incredible explanation of this, and I resonate deeply with everything that she shares. We talk about the importance of setting boundaries and why putting yourself is not only not selfish, but will help you show up better to the world. And she gives tools and tips on how to navigate your own inner journey to better understanding yourself. So without further ado, please welcome Caroline to A Sharper Life. So Caroline, we just off camera, we were talking about how the first time that I feel like this is such a good story to lead into. The first time that we were going to record this podcast, you were in a hotel. The internet was breaking up. I had an echo in my headphones, and your camera equipment and podcasting equipment got lost. And so we then rescheduled, and we're here now today. And both of us are in a place being like, okay, make sure everything's okay. You just mentioned that you have your stress pen. And so I thought, what a kind of funny story to kick off. Here we are, 2 experts that we're going to be talking about stress and how to navigate all of these different things. And here we are, the actual experts, being like, okay, take a deep breath. So I wanted to lead off with that because it was kind of funny.
That is so true. It was really funny. And these are the exact moments where I'm like, do what you always preach to others, do go back into what can you actually control, ground yourself into the moment, and just wait what happens and take it step by step. That's really what I try to do myself.
I love it. And I couldn't agree more. And just as you're listening, normally I don't kick off an interview with just a random story like that, but I thought it was very relevant because so often, and Caroline, I'm sure you agree, we see people on Instagram or social media, and people look at you, I'm sure they look at me like we have it all together. And the reality is we have learned a lot of tips and tools, and we do put them into practice. And there's moments where we also feel overwhelmed and frustrated. So with that being said, let's just dive straight into this. If someone is feeling flustered or stressed out, or Zoom isn't working, a meeting has gone unplanned, or something's gone wrong with it, what are a few tips for someone to navigate the stress that comes up in the body?
The first tip that I always would not just tell others, but also myself, is basically pause. Take a break. Because whatever you're trying to do is you're doing it from a level of anxiety, from a stress response, and that's going to be way too fast. You might go down sort of a rabbit hole. Just pause. Take a moment. These 2 minutes of taking that break and grounding yourself and maybe focusing on, hey, what's going on inside of me will not change much, but they will change you. And then you can tackle things in a much, much better state. And actually you will get maybe even better to your outcome or to the desired outcome or whatever you're trying to fix right now, instead of just keep going and running on that stress. So the first thing is respond to your body, pause, take a break, do what's good for you, and then keep going.
Why is it so hard though, in the moment when stress comes up, to take that pause?
Because we're so reactive. We're reacting to something and immediately trying to also, let's say, fix it. And that's a very much automated response. But in that sense, what happens is, and it goes with, say, in extreme stressful moments, we're going into survival mode, let's say, or so that certain parts of our brain just are not really online anymore. But if you ground yourself and you take that pause and you make that step back, you're actually giving also that short window where things can, let's say, go back online, so that that part of, like, let's say, more rational way of thinking will kick back in. So that pause, and when you practice it more consistently, will make and can be actually even life changing in so many ways, because your decision making is a total different one than instead of just running on that train of stress and trying to fix things that are feeling in that moment even out of control.
Very interesting. And just tying back the story that I opened with, of us having to, or us choosing to move the podcast, I can see that in that moment we were both a bit flustered, a bit stressed out. You didn't have your podcast up. For me, the audio wasn't working. And I feel like we both did that, and we took that pause and we came together and decided to reschedule rather than pushing through. And I think so often people, instead of taking that pause, and as you're saying, Caroline, that the pause can allow us to then have a better situation or reaction happen. Had we forced ourselves into the podcast, I guarantee it wouldn't have been nearly as good. And so when someone is in that pause, and the pause being, you mentioned 2 minutes, because I think people can get in their minds of like, I don't have 20 minutes. I have to make a decision now. So let's just say it's 2 minutes. Are there any questions or body practices that you would recommend someone to do when they're in that kind of the fight or flight, really activated stage?
In that really activated stage, a lot of times people notice maybe the anxiety, the stress, but they're very much stuck in their head. So the practice that I always recommend is, it sounds very simple, but it is that simple. Do a body scan. Check in. Wait a minute. What am I feeling physically? And it's not that you have to identify the emotion of and naming it, but it's more like, where is that stress right now responding? Is my heart pumping? Is my stomach sort of like squeezing? Or do I feel a bit nauseous? Some people experience headaches, or tension around their neck. Just notice and go inward. And sometimes closing your eyes can help, because you're also in a state of overwhelm. So that can be that you're very hypervigilant. So shutting out like one of those senses of like closing my eyes, and I'm trying to picture my heart, trying to feel maybe with my hands, guide myself into like my stomach, touch my body, and just breathe. That is such a grounding practice. And the more you do it, it becomes a stronger sort of thing. It's like going to the gym. The more you do it, the stronger the muscle gets. And it's the same with that body scan. In the beginning, it takes you maybe a little bit longer to find that sort of sense of calm back inside of yourself. But the more you do it, the more basically your nervous system and your brain get used to it. And they're like, oh yeah, that's what we're doing now. We're coming back to the present moment. We're grounding ourselves. And that's wonderful. And that's another reason why I have, for example, my stress band. You can use certain tools as well to help yourself physically, because when you're stuck in your head, replacing a thought with another thought, or these things like, oh, just calm down and relax, it doesn't work. You need to use a holistic approach. At least that's what I've experienced and seen in people, to help yourself. So grounding yourself with small, simple things, using a pen, feeling it slowly, or working with your senses. That means whatever's available. For me, it's now here, cup of tea, smelling it, these things, and doing it with that slogan in your mind, slow. So repeating yourself, everything I do is slow. Everything I do is slow. Because when you're stressed, you're all over the place, also physically. But your speech also, you notice it, is faster. So do things consciously, slow, for these 2 minutes, and you will see a change.
You said so many great things there. And what I find interesting is there are so many people that say slowing down or feeling my emotions is woo woo. And the reality is it's not. The other thing that you had mentioned is that the brain is always looking for solutions, thoughts, it's thinking its way through the problem. And I like to say the mind that created the problem cannot find the solution. And so I love this practicality of the 2 minutes, and in that 2 minutes, have a pen, have a cup of tea, the slowing down, and we're gonna definitely touch on that. I remember someone that I worked with had told me if I'm, let's say, activated, and I like the word activated more than triggered, because then I can think about my nervous system is starting to speed up. I can feel my heart racing. So when I love traveling, and what a conundrum. I hate airports because I don't like how busy it is and all the people, and I find people rude. And so I really have learned, and this woman that I'd worked with said, in that moment that you're getting activated, which is, I found in that 2 minutes, look for 5 things that are blue. And then as soon as you find those, look for 5 things that are white. And because I'm doing that, I'm getting out of the mind, the thinking and how chaotic it is. I'm getting in touch more with the body, and I'm focusing my attention. You said something though about the nervous system, and I'd love to get into this because by the way, for anyone listening, if you don't follow Caroline on Instagram, you must. Caroline, you do the most incredible videos, and I'm always so inspired with everything that you share. But you talk a lot about trauma and the nervous system. So I'd like to get into helping everyone understand what is trauma, number one. So we'll start there. What is trauma? And then number 2, how does trauma relate to our nervous system? And giving kind of a macro picture for people, and then we can dive in deeper.
Mm-hmm. So trauma in itself is, and that's where a huge misconception is, because the word trauma is actually wound. And wound means also, in a way, anything that is and can be overwhelming for our mind or the nervous system. So that means something that can be an emotional, overwhelming situation, that can be, yes, a loss of someone, a breakup. It can be also other things like growing up in emotional neglect in a home where there's a lot of stress and chaos, meaning parents arguing, dismissing us. There's a lot of ways how we can potentially experience trauma, and there's small traumas and big traumas, but it's more like how everyone individually experiences and holds on or experiences that traumatic event, but also, is it impacting your brain? Because if we are exposed to, let's say, a chronic home, for example, filled with stress, eventually we adapt to it. That means our nervous system that travels through our whole body constantly feels in fight or flight mode. That means we're experiencing that constant level of stress, and that our brain responds as well. So there's changes and I have to say can change our brain. There's like the alarm system, that's our amygdala, that can change due to science in size, but that also makes it hypersensitive. So that means it goes off basically even in moments when we are actually safe. So that it's a little bit like wrongly wired in a way. So we're constantly in hypervigilance state, and these things, and that's where the mind-body connection is such an important element. They ping pong off of each other. So there's a constant connection saying like, we're stressed, and that changes how we, and that's the thing, perceive the world outside of ourselves, but also what we believe things about ourselves. And that's what trauma basically is. Trauma, and we all experience this, and I think that's also why it's such an important topic, and it's fairly new, because we all experience trauma on different levels, and seemingly, and that's the feedback that I receive also, a lot of people grew up in a certain way or are culturally impacted, or yes, they're impacted by wars, but that travels, and that's where generational trauma plays also a role. It travels through generations from an epigenetic point of view. So you hold also things from your, let's say, ancestors, not even knowing that you do. And all of those things come together in yourself, and that's basically what trauma is. So that you can, and that's an important message, I think, we cannot avoid traumas. certain things just happen to us, and it's part of life. But it's important to understand what happens physiologically also in our body, how is the nervous system responding. And a lot of people with trauma live in a chronic state of stress. That's their normal.
So, tailbacking on that, and then I do have some follow-up questions on that. What are the signs that someone may have trauma? And the reason that I want to ask this question, and I'll give a bunch of examples about my own life and growing up, because I've done a lot of work to understand my own trauma, let's say. But I feel like so many people, there's almost two camps. There's those who say, right, I grew up with a traumatic family or something trauma happened to me. And then there's other people who don't associate any sort of trauma in their life. Like my mother, for example, would never say that she had a traumatic childhood. She's always said, I don't need to go to therapy. And yet then I can see, obviously, with generational things and the way that I grew up, I guess it's some people just don't know what the symptoms or signs of having trauma are. So can we start there?
It's First, I need to dive into like the generational part. Like, for example, our parents. I think back then the belief was always, well, if you have room and shelter, food on the table, you are able to go to school. What you have, let's say, two parents or like parents available to an extent, then what do you have to complain about? And that's where already the the core belief changes in generations, because we are now much more aware that there's much more to also potential trauma, and that's also the emotional neglect part. Kids need to be felt heard, seen, respected as human beings, even though they're little, and that's an important element. So that's a new, let's say, generation awareness that our previous generation doesn't have, and there's still this huge stigma around mental health, of course. So you were only seeing a psychologist or therapist if, let's say, there was something wrong, I'm quote unquoting this, with you. That meant crazy, and people had that sort of idea about it. But when it comes to trauma, and trauma can show up in many, many different ways. It shows up in, let's say, smaller things like sleep issues, that you struggle sleeping, that you're constantly waking up. There's a chronic state of hypervigilance, so that means you're constantly scanning outside of yourself, reading people's facial expressions, emotions. A lot of times you don't feel safe, and you don't even know why. It can be even that you're sitting in a bar, you're out and about, and you just have that constant feeling, I'm not safe. And some people struggle, and that's a very important one, regulating their emotions. That's something I see a lot, that people actually are not aware of their emotions, and then they have explosive tendencies, or some people even rage attacks, or get very easily, let's say, activated or triggered, and have then on the other hand phases where they feel like very numb or very sad. So there's like a very much like a roller coaster of emotions that they feel like they have no grip over it. Another thing is also that they struggle with their own, let's say, self-perception, and that means inside of yourself you carry a very harsh inner critic that constantly sort of shames you, guilts you, and makes you. And that's another thing. It's almost a textbook, let's say, phrase that a lot of people say to me when they have trauma. I feel I'm broken. That feeling of like I'm broken, and I don't want people to see I'm different. That is something that is also a sign of trauma. That you also have, and that's another thing, difficulties in relationships, that you end up maybe in, let's say, similar cycles of, let's say, toxic relationships, or that you're not able to form a close bond in relationships, that there's always a level of I cannot trust you, I don't trust you, or that's on a surface for a lot of people, that they cannot create a level of emotional intimacy even though they really, really want it. And I think that the most prominent ones are that you have unexplained phases of depression, and you really don't know why this is happening, and a chronic state, let's say, of anxiety. So it comes and goes, and you cannot pinpoint why you're feeling anxious. It, for a lot of people, a lot of people feel a lifelong like this. And eventually, and that's a little bit something that happens later on in people's life, because when you're younger, you're quite easily able to distract and cope. But a lot of people later on in life feel extremely helpless and hopeless and cannot, and that's another thing, envision a future for themselves. So it's like, there's nothing good in the cards for me kind of feeling.
I mean, I feel like you just described the old me to the exact T, and I think you just described like every human being. I feel like there's at least 2 or 3 points that every single person listening will be like, "Yep, that's me." So then the question almost becomes, what does one do other than like that 2-minute regulating? Because what I'm hearing is that when we have trauma, and I do have a question about, is trauma, does it come from childhood and then gets, like, the brain does confirmation bias as we get older, or can you have a traumatic event at any point that then sets you on this path? And the reason I ask that is because everything you just said, that was me my whole life until I did the inner work to change, because I didn't like feeling that way. But if someone is feeling all of these things and then it gets to this place of, yeah, like helplessness, hopeless, what do you do? What's the path forward for someone at any stage of feeling what you just described?
To answer that first question, like, there is also a big difference between, and that's how I sort of distinguish between, let's say, what's complex trauma and what's really PTSD. Because an event that happens in your life that can, and not for everyone, potentially, for example, cause you PTSD. But if you're exposed to something, and that can be also in adult life, let's say, toxic relationship, I'm being very specific here, with a narcissist, psychopath, so to speak, and you're exposed for way too long, for example, to a relationship like this. But this can also be in your childhood, that you lived around a narcissistic parent, as an example, or a lot of chronically emotional neglect, physical abuse. That is something different. That trickles into your personality, and that's complex PTSD. So the difference, and that's how I envision, is like the difference between complex PTSD and PTSD is basically, with complex PTSD, your personality is not this, the word is not developed, but it trickles into your core beliefs of your personality. PTSD is, you can almost identify the events that happened, and that would be, for example, a car accident or something like this, a medical trauma, these sort of, let's say, specific events. But complex PTSD is so chronic that that's your normal. That's what you grew up with. And that is harder also to identify for a lot of people. That's to answer that question.
Yeah, I wanted to add, just add and share something on that really quick. As you were speaking, I was thinking about, so I had been diagnosed with complex PTSD much later, I think a year or two ago. And it made sense because everything you listed, I had 2 eating disorders. I realized that I was attracting and choosing more narcissistic relationships. I had a horrible relationship with my own body, hypervigilant. And it's interesting, it's kind of that catch-22, or like the double-edged sword, which, being hypervigilant and learning how to read people has also allowed me to become really, really good at what I do for a living. And so I'm able to take all of that and help people. But what I found interesting in what you just said was, because of this complex PTSD, like my divorce, for example, that was both traumatic and it was PTSD, but it was really complex because of the nature of the person that I was divorcing, the nature of the like when people find out that I was married for only a year, I'm like, yeah, I managed to get out after a year of a very, very toxic relationship. But I also understand now that I was kind of putting myself and allowing that treatment without necessarily knowing it. And that then tied back to things that happened in childhood. I was only able to understand that once I got divorced and worked through those. But I can see how similar patterns had been repeated throughout my life because of what I experience. And I want to do one really quick caveat for anyone listening, and then I'll come back to you, Caroline, and I'm sure you'll agree with this. This is not to say, and everything that I'm talking about and what you're saying, it's not to put any blame on my parents. And I'm not saying that, I had a fucked up childhood because they were horrible. Like, I know that my parents genuinely did the best they could, and they were having their own internal challenges with one another. And the neglect came from because they were not coherent and having a conducive, loving relationship. There was challenges that made it so they were not as available and present, and they didn't soothe me. Let's say if they had a fight, I would hang out downstairs by myself and be alone. That's where my childhood trauma came from. It wasn't my parents being bad people. And I think when we talk about trauma or trauma from childhood, people start to feel guilty about, blaming their parents. Like, did my parents do something horrible? Or I know parents that are like, did I fuck my child up? So I just wanted to put that in as a caveat because I'm sure you've heard that as well.
Comes to, and I think that's a very important message, by the way, Nikki, that it's not about blaming our parents at all. And that actually here, the answer that I'm going to give now is actually also answering the previous question, what to do. The first and the most important step, and maybe you agree because I think you've done the work yourself, is the self-awareness. And that's not about blaming. It's more becoming aware for ourselves, like, wait, where's that red line? That red line, why and how am I repeating specific cycles in my life that are actually unhealthy for me, that drive me maybe into these, let's say, toxic relationships that unfortunately you had to experience and go through and endure, and that you don't want to have in your future anymore because they cause you pain. So where is that red line, that root cause? And our parents are not to blame at all. We can love them dearly, and that's absolutely okay, because they had only available what they knew at that time. And there was a total different time. It was a total different level of awareness. And that's the difference between our generation and them. We can, and we have now the tools to create that awareness, work through, and that's the thing, these root causes, and change our course and rewrite our own story so that we don't have, let's say, a thriller to write at the end of it with a terrible ending. No, we're gonna write our own happy ending. And that is very different, that we deserve that, and not to repeat these cycles over and over, because there is a level, and that's the hopelessness and helplessness a lot of times in people. I end up at the same spot. It's like a Groundhog Day all over, every other year, every 5 years, and so on. And it's very much frustrating, and it's makes you also feel very lonely. And we refine and recreate these patterns from our past. So self-awareness, finding the root cause, that red line, is the very first step for everyone who struggles with trauma, to get that overview and mapping out what's happening actually inside of myself. And that in itself is like really empowering, already understanding and getting to know yourself, like, wow, this is where I'm repeating things. This is what happened to me. And then being able to specifically work through these patterns and make it, let's say, make it to the other side and live a life that is more fulfilling. That is wonderful. And that's what it's all about.
I couldn't agree more. You just mentioned patterns, and I think this is a very important thing for everyone to learn and understand. Just as I had mentioned, I saw that I was repeating certain patterns in relationships based on something from my childhood of what I grew up, what was familiar to me, familiar to my brain, to my nervous system. So what are some common patterns that you've seen in people, just as like a generalization, that we repeat without necessarily knowing it?
It's definitely the relationships. That's definitely one thing, that people end up in a certain kind of relationship, but it's also the relationship within yourself. So the pattern is a lot of times ways of coping, let's say, can be perfectionism, overworking, constantly shaming ourselves, feeling guilty for things. People pleasing is a tricky word. because it's a fawn response, which I prefer to say, to be honest, because it keeps us safe. So we put the focus on what other people would think of us, so that by making sure they're happy with us, which means we cross our sometimes even our own boundaries, but that's a level of, I have a level of control and can keep myself in a safe place. So these are certain things that I see a lot in people, that they cross their own boundaries, that they emphasize a lot on like making other people happy around them, please them, overwork, overperform. And then yeah, there's a level of like people ending up in burnout, depression, anxiety. That's what I see a lot.
I feel like you just described so many women, especially now, from the overworking, the to-do list, the burnout. And I notice there's a lot of people, at least clients, women that come to me, a lot of people pleasing without necessarily knowing that someone is people pleasing. You just mentioned that it's a fawn response. Can you, I mean, I'd love to just dive into this a bit more, because you mentioned something about it's a form of control. What exactly does this mean with people pleasing?
So a lot of times, and that can already start in childhood, that we've learned I need to make mom happy or keep dad happy, can be also siblings or extended family, in order to feel safe. So if I, that's very much like, let's say, feedback driven. And if you receive a positive feedback about yourself, or you get, let's say, the thumbs up for achieving certain things, it's a good feeling. And if that's the only way, let's say growing up, we get a form of attention, or we get a form of affection, that means love, attention, a hug, or praise, we learn very quickly this is the way to go about in life. This is the way I can be seen for at least a glimpse of a moment. I can connect with mom and dad. They're happy with me. So that pattern becomes deeply ingrained, and we become very achievement driven, as an example. So that goes into I'm constantly working because I'm almost addicted to getting the feeling, because deep down inside of myself, the core belief is I'm not good enough. So you're battling it and tackling it with the outside world by trying to receive positive feedback so that you can feel good about yourself, because the level of trust, and that's again the trauma response, is very low within yourself. Can I trust myself? Am I worthy enough? Do I love myself enough? Core belief is no, I'm not worthy enough. So I need to find it somewhere else so that I can feel good about myself. That is a level of control in that sense. So if I keep you happy and I get a smile from you, or thank you, Caroline, that's wonderful for helping me, I feel good in that moment. And I feel like in that moment, that uncomfortable feeling of not good enough, that doubt, that self-doubt is like, oh, am I good enough? What am I, how am I feeling? That feeling is eased in that moment, but it creeps in, and that's the tricky part. A week later, a few days later, everyone is a bit different, it would pop up again, and I need again the reassurance from the outside world. And however I'm gonna get it, I will try to receive it. And that's where people then get stuck in these loops, again, overworking, overpleasing, crossing their own boundaries, just to get that feedback again, to feel okay within themselves. And that's a control mechanism of like, I need to feel in control, that I feel safe within myself, to not allow this uncomfortable feeling, that emotion that's attached to it, that can be sadness, there can be a lot of, anger as well, that I've learned somewhere in my life that this is not how I should be feeling. This is inadequate, and I need to suppress however possible.
Oof, I feel like that was just a mic drop moment for everyone listening. You explain that so eloquently and profoundly. Now, the follow-up question, because I know we all deal with thoughts of not feeling good enough, not feeling worthy or deserving, not liking ourselves. I understand we've talked about, having awareness in the inner work, but really here, once you're, I feel like people, I don't even like the term. I feel like it's so negative, but people that tend to please others before themselves, or put others before themselves. What's the solution then to besides that, the self-awareness, because now you're asking someone to sit with that discomfort of, oh, I don't actually like myself and I have to put myself first. Where does someone start going with that? Like, how do we overcome it?
So a lot of times, let's say that people pleaser or the person living in that fawn response actually has a very negative inner voice about themselves. And that's the inner critic, the harsh inner critic that constantly would also guilt and shame you if you started to put yourself on the, let's say, priority list, right? So it's like, ooh, you shouldn't be on it. Most people are not on their list at all. They only have the carrot somewhere. If you ever get, and finish that thing, then you will get something nice or you get that break. It never happens. It's that loop of, and that's also the anxiety that constantly drives you into, you need to do more and you need to do more for others. And the practice basically to retrain yourself, it's really a retraining and also learning to sit with these emotions. It's not an overnight practice, but it really starts with tackling that inner critic. And that's a bit of like working through also past, let's say, traumas, but also becoming more self-compassionate, becoming a little bit more kinder. And that's a slow practice. It starts with, I always like it practical in a way, start small, with baby steps. Become aware. And that's the thing, when that inner critic arises, and give that inner critic a name, because it feels very much like it's you, but it's not. Sometimes it's an echo of your past. It can be parents, I don't know, can be teachers, can be a lot of people. But give it a name. Learn to detach from that inner voice that you're so strongly connected to. And the more you practice it, and there's also journaling, a big aspect of it, there's also that inner, deeper, let's say, trauma work of traveling through and sitting with the emotions. There's definitely a form of meditate, let's say, with these emotions, or let's say go into become more mindful, to allow yourself to sit with uncomfortable feelings, but not for an hour. Expand that window of tolerance and sit with it for a minute. Start somewhere, but make it small practical steps. But again, starts with level of awareness, and then step by step doing also the somatic work. And that means include your body, check how you feel, allow yourself to sit with it, work with it through the journaling, and maybe join a community of people, a course or somewhere where people are very specific. I'll do it as well, so that I guide people exactly through that channeling. And it's really challenging that inner critic. It's challenging that and changing that inner voice. That's the core element for it.
I love everything you just shared, Caroline. And just to reiterate, I teach such similar things, and this is what's fascinating, is we have different language, but I always tell people, keep it stupid simple. Whenever you're doing something, a goal, a journey, keep it stupid simple, because the mind is already complicating things enough. I call the inner critic your Siamese twin. And I have people draw literally another head coming out of your neck. And I remember when I came up with this drawing, because I'm like, this voice, it's taking over. It's so bitchy. It's so loud. And I have then people literally create their Siamese twin, which is the ego mind, which is, we know the protective mechanism, and really allows you to disassociate. So what you'd said, name it to tame it. And I have people name it to either a bully from childhood, or a parent who really, put you down, or just someone that you feel triggered by. So very, very interesting. Question on that. You mentioned journaling a few times, and I always get this, not always, but oftentimes get this comment of people saying, I don't even know where to start, what to journal on. So what are a few just easy journal prompts that you would say for someone to start with?
The first thing that I would always recommend is start with mapping out your thoughts. So if you notice, and then do it for a week, max 2, what's the repetitive thoughts that you're having? Because they are repetitive. That's the interesting part, even though we have tons of thoughts, but you will probably think on a daily basis of certain thoughts quite like yesterday, So it's like, write them down. Even though you know them in your mind, it's important to write them down to create that level of awareness, because the theme, you might find a theme along, let's say, those thoughts. They're like, okay, wow, it's always ending up criticizing me or shaming me, guilting me for to do more. It's so helpful to understand that. So writing down, let's say, these negative thoughts about yourself in terms of like bullet points, extremely helpful. And then learning, and that's the next step, to challenge those thoughts, but in a way of like what's acceptable. We are not looking for what would be an ideal, the perfect way of thinking. That's basically two extremes you're going into, and that's the thing, the gray zone of things. Because a lot of times we are very black and white in our way of thinking. It's also often also very distorted in a way. It's like, no, you consciously sit down, and it is a little bit of work, but sit down. What's the gray zone? What could I live with thinking about myself? And the more you script that a little bit for yourself, but the more you have a script, eventually you will rehearse it in your mind. So if that thought occurs again and you're like, oh, I always told myself you should do more. Wait a minute, I rescripted that. I remember what I wrote there. I wrote, no, it's okay to take a break for now and I'll do more later. You will think of this eventually, and then you will do, and that's the thing, your actions will eventually align with your way of thinking, because you will take that break. And it will feel uncomfortable at the start, but the more you do it, it will not make you lazy, it will make you not a bad person, it will get you to the same or even more to achieve your goals, but you will get there with a much more compassionate and kinder inner voice that has you in your mind and protects you and doesn't push you over the edge. And that's very important. That is also a level of safety that you will feel inside of yourself, that again trickles eventually also in your nervous system. Because instead of running on stress, you're like, I can take a breather. It's okay. And I can still run that marathon, but in a total different way of experiencing it.
Fascinating what you just shared there. And it got me thinking to the slowdown, because you mentioned in your answer just now of allowing ourselves to slow down in order to then recreate and really retrain the brain, but create a new narrative of the looping thoughts that happen. I know, I mean, I'm sure you've experienced it. I know I have. I work with clients all the time, but this slow down, right? Slowing down. It's so simple in one way, and yet it feels impossible for so many people. And for me, it took many years of learning to slow down consciously. And I remember actually when I was married, my ex would get up at like 4:35 a.m. And I found myself starting to get into similar, not that early, but similar patterns where I'd get up and I have to go. And I found myself burning out. And so in my divorce and over the summer, I did the thing that scared me the most, which was basically pause everything, pause my business as much as I could, pause my podcast, sit, do nothing, which was terrifying for me to do. And yet I personally now can see the slowdown. And just as you were saying, the inner critic, it's like the more I've slowed down, the less that inner critic's voice is loud. Like her voice is almost gone. But I want to ask, for someone who is in that beginning stage of, I can't slow down, I got shit to do, I got a to-do list, right? I have kids. Why is it so hard to slow down and step out of that survival mode?
That's for a lot of people because they're so long in it, so they don't know themselves any other way. So you're again already in your, let's say, pattern of what you know. And that's the hardest part. Stepping out into the unknown. And the unknown can be, oh, I'm doing things differently. Because when you are in survival mode, even though you do not like it, and it is still your familiar place, and somehow deep down inside of you, you can still predict what's going to happen. Yes, you might feel exhausted. Yes, you might go into burnout, but it's predictable for you on a subconscious level. And stepping out of survival mode is so hard because you're also basically walking into the unknown. And in the beginning, the level of anxiety, and I think that's a very important message here, the level of anxiety is almost exactly the same. So you would be doubting if you do things differently, if it's actually working, because you're first battling and tackling the same level of anxiety and uncertainty. And traveling through and walking through uncertainty is like literally like walking like in the dark room. You have no idea if you're finding the door. But the beautiful part is, and I think that's what your work is and a little bit my work is, they're guiding lights. Is this torch that guides you towards the light, towards the door. You just need to trust, and trust that eventually that anxiety that you're on both paths, experience, if you start walking in that dark room and heading into a direction with a bit of a step-by-step plan, tools that work for many others, um, practical steps, eventually you will get there. And that's the thing, trust yourself and just start walking. Baby steps, follow that light, you will get there.
Beautiful. As we're talking, something just came up for me, which is grief. And the reason that this thought just came up is because as we're walking into uncertainty, typically it means that we have to let go of something, an old thought, an old belief, an old way of doing something, letting go of a relationship. So as we enter into that trust and we enter into a new normal, because, and I'll just add this, that when someone is in a place, that survival mode or that people pleasing mode, we know, like, we don't like it. We all know it doesn't feel good. We know the patterns suck. It's like you tell yourself you're not going to drink and then you go drink. You tell yourself you're not going to push yourself in work and you're going to take the breaks and then you don't. Like, we all know that it doesn't feel good. And so as we're walking that line into that new normal, there is going to be a certain sense of letting go of the past. And that I've seen people get so stuck on, one, because they don't know how to deal with or manage grief that comes up. And two, and this is an even bigger one, that people don't necessarily understand that, yes, you do have to grieve the former sides of you, just as if someone dies, there's a grieving process. So can you talk more about that and how grief, I guess, is a role within our life? And I mean, so many people are avoiding it.
Because grief immediately, at least in my mind, equals pain. And as a natural response, we all want to avoid pain. It's something we don't want, and that's what keeps us again in that known familiar place, even though that's painful too. Because there's also this deep belief it's not going to get better, it's just going to get more painful. And that's where emotional regulation, but also that understanding of how do I travel through my emotions without them, let's say, overwhelming me to the extent that I'm not able to function in life anymore. There's also deep fear, and we are fear-based people, like human beings are fear-based, and that's a good level of protection, of course. But if I'm able, and that's again attached to practices, navigate and travel and guide myself through that grief, through those stages, and allow also to experience, let's say, anger in a way. Anger is healthy. There's a deep belief like anger is like negative. No, anger is a healthy emotion to experience. And so is sadness, and there's something on the other side of it. It's two sides of the coin. Whereas there's sadness, there's happiness and joy. We can only experience, and that's the interesting part, both emotions if we know how to travel through them and actually have felt both of them. And that's what freeze a lot of times does. People don't experience anything. They're just numb because they have not learned to travel through any of the emotions. So therefore they can also not feel joy anymore. And that's the thing. Learn, and there are literally practices. Again, it's also somatic, but also on a cognitive level. There are ways to navigate and travel and allow emotions to surface in a healthy way. And it starts small. I'm very practical in that sense. I always talk in my work, start with a mirror, sit down with a mirror, start dating yourself. Very strange, awkward feeling. People look at me very like, what's wrong with you, Caroline? What a weird suggestion, but it's very powerful, and the feedback has always been very positive. And it's so easy. Take a small or big mirror and just start eye gazing, basically, with yourself. Asking yourself open questions, simple questions. How am I doing? How am I really doing? And look into your own eyes, and do that for, on a daily basis, 2 minutes every day for 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks straight. And a lot of people have given the feedback, my God, I sobbed, I cried. In the beginning, I felt super awkward. All of these are things, are emotions and things you feel in your body. Sit with them. And that is already a very nice way of connecting with yourself and taking the time to get to know yourself.
Mirror work. I'm sitting, for those of you who are not watching this, I'm sitting here like with a big grin laughing because I remember many times that I did mirror work. Holy shit, is it uncomfortable? And I can attest to when you continue to do it, and especially for me doing it through my divorce where I felt like shit. I to someone else, maybe I looked okay, but I didn't feel good internally or externally. And yeah, looking in the mirror and talking to myself. And my thing is I talk to my inner child and I always say, baby girl. So I'm like, it's okay, baby girl, you look beautiful. And I can say that doing that through the hardest period of my life, now I look in the mirror and that inner critic is just, she's not there. Even if I'm hungover, for example, even if I didn't get enough sleep, she's not there because I've sat with myself. But mirror work is both incredibly hard and one of the most profoundly powerful things if you genuinely want to step into more love and acceptance of yourself. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. And it is so fascinating. I feel like, Caroline, as you were mentioning, that people get into a numb state where they can't even feel joy. And I know I have so many friends, so many clients, that it's not just about the quote unquote negative emotions, right? We don't like to feel anger and sadness. Why? Yeah, they're uncomfortable. And as you mentioned, the brain doesn't like discomfort. At the same time, though, I find just as many people bypassing and avoiding and numbing joy and love and connection, because those are also uncomfortable if you don't feel good within yourself. So I wanted to reiterate everything you're saying and really affirm, like, it all is true and it works. I'm curious though, Caroline, what got you so passionate into doing what you do and teaching this, and then how you almost translate it into Instagram with these they're short but very powerful videos. So what was your journey to get here?
I've always obviously had a curiosity for the human mind. So becoming a psychologist was obviously for me something almost next to nature. It was like always something that I wanted to do, look behind the curtains, understand people, what's really going on and how they became how they are, and without, let's say, a level of judgment. But I have to say, and that's the thing, I also experienced my own level of trauma. And that's the reason why I'm also on social media. Because I first of all saw that and everyone said, you cannot bring trauma relatable into social media. It's a way too heavy topic. Again, I disagreed because I see it and I experienced it personally. That's another thing. And I see it also in daily life in other people. And it is very much relatable. And I wanted to bring that awareness of, hey, you're not alone. Because one thing that I felt, and maybe you can relate as well, Nikki, when you're struggling with trauma, you feel so alone.
Oh, you feel so alone.
No one gets you. And that's a very, very heavy place to be, because you're in such a overwhelmed state, so alone. And I said to myself, and that was a promise I made to myself, if I ever make it out of this alive, I'm sorry that I have to be so detailed, but it was very much that promise to myself, I will make sure that I'll help others to find that guiding light that I had needed as well. And that's what I'm doing. And that's why I'm on social media, and everything I do comes from a place either I've experienced it literally personally, or I see it in the people around me, but from a level of understanding, hey, I see that you're dealing with trauma, and it helps so many, even these small reels, and they really come from a place of what I see in daily life.
You and I it's fascinating, Caroline. We have such, like, the context is different, but such similar stories. I remember in 2012 or 2013, I had my Instagram account and I used to post headless body shots of myself because I didn't want people knowing who I was, but I was very open, very vulnerable. I was really, one of the people who started this whole vulnerability movement on Instagram back in the day, because I would talk about my body dysmorphia and I would talk about all of the challenges that I was going through. And so people felt safe and seen that here I am sharing. But why I bring that up is I would binge. I would go into the binge and restrict cycle and, all the things we've discussed and the trauma, the feedback loop of the negative thoughts, all of it. I experienced, but I remember, and it's still to this moment, clear as day. I was in my kitchen in South Kensington 11 years ago, and I had just binged, and I felt fucking awful. And just as you mentioned, Caroline, I felt alone. I felt like I had nobody to talk to. And even though I was open on social media, it was in that moment where I was like, I just need, not even want, I was like, I need to know that the people that I look up to, which were the supermodels back in the day, because that's where I thought my life path was going. Thank God it changed direction. But I'm like, I just need to know that Giselle and Miranda Kerr have a bad day. I need to know that they binge. I need to know that they drink and don't like themselves. And the exact is, same as you, where I'm like, they never came out and said it. And even Miranda Kerr wrote a book, both of them did. They're like, yeah, life really hasn't been that bad. And I was like, okay, I don't relate to you at all. And I remember thinking, same. If I come out of this, I want to inspire other people and give them hope because I know what it feels like to feel so alone. And I never want someone to feel that place that I was at. So it kind of interesting that we have such a similar story in that.
That is really amazing because what you're describing is, Nikki, and that's a very vulnerable place. You're showing your true authentic self. And I think that is what we both are doing in different ways. But I think that's also a little bit an overall message to society, I would almost say. It's like, hey, let's not only show what we want people to see, because that's what we're used to in society. That's what literally what you said, these books, these magazines want to present us the perfect life that no one has. And I can say that without naming names. There are many people in positions where you would be like, you have it all, and they're very unhappy. And that is not attached to, let's say, a bank account happiness, or it's how you are inside of yourself. So many people are struggling, and it deserves that awareness, and that can only happen through being authentic and real and vulnerable.
And vulnerable. The last thing that I'd like to go over, because you just mentioned it, is the vulnerability, authenticity, really transparency. So the question on this is, why do so many people put on masks? And how do you know if you're wearing a mask, and how do you take a mask off?
I think society, and a lot of times that's also down to parenting, again, without blaming our parents, but it's a society thing. We are very used to having to put on masks because a lot of times we have that deep belief, otherwise I'm weak, or it's used against me, or I'm taking advantage of. So a lot of people cope with that mask, which is fine, I guess, to a certain level, because we don't need to share with everyone our vulnerabilities. But people who are wearing masks, or actually even switching these masks, like social chameleons, for example, they know this because they live with themselves. And you cannot, and that's the tricky part, fool yourself, because you're sitting with yourself 24/7. That means your thoughts, the way you feel. And it shows in ways that you're just not, your outside world doesn't match with your internal experience. You're not happy, you feel depressed, you're anxious, you're overthinking, overanalyzing things. You're just never reaching that level of, I am happy to be me. And that's I think that's the most important message. You notice when you switch these masks, because it becomes eventually heavy and you just don't want to do it anymore.
Interesting. And I'll add one thing on that of, I find so often people, and it goes actually exactly to what you had mentioned earlier about how we become affirmed as kids. Like, let's say you make a funny joke and then you make your parents laugh, and that affirms that now I'm a comedian because that's where I get the love. And so I find very often that people put on masks without knowing that they are. Like women, there's a typical one of got to be strong, right? I got to be strong for the family. I can't cry in front of my kids. I got to have it all together. Or if I don't have it together, I won't find a partner. I'm all of these different beliefs. And so we put on these masks. And when I help clients kind of see what they are and then take them off, what's behind it is, if I'm not this person or this mask that I'm holding up, I won't be liked. And I have people go through an exercise. Okay, what happens if you're liked? And we can always kind of tail end it back to, I'll be alone. I'll end up turning into one of my parents, right? Same behaviors, thoughts, or what's the point of living? And so you can almost see that the fear is so great of taking these masks off because we're so terrified to be judged by other people. And I think that ties back, Caroline, to what you were saying of us not liking ourselves. And so just to really pull this all together, that what you and I teach, there's multiple facets to it and factors, but I think at the core essence, we teach people how to get in tune with themselves so that you really begin to like yourself. So you're not a different person and you don't have to hide and numb yourself. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Because if you stripped everything away, the deep down question is, would you hang out with yourself? Do you then like yourself? And a lot of people would answer, no, not really. And that's very sad. And the teaching part that we are doing is like, hey, let's become connected with yourself again and learn to accept, but also love yourself the way you are. And that means, on the other hand, you don't need to be liked by everyone. And that's okay. And that is the challenge to navigate through. But it's beautiful because it creates such a level of stability and being grounded within yourself that is the empowering part, because that means I know who I am and I'm okay with that. It means also not everything is perfect, doesn't need to be, but I am, and that trickles then into also relationships, the way you connect, the way you also speak with people. So the more you transform within, the more relationships outside of yourself transform as well. But there's such a big opportunity, such a beautiful part with it, because these become so deeply connected relationships that you feel alive. And I think a lot of people do not feel alive. And let's say that level of joy or that level of emotional intimacy that for a lot of people is a huge question mark, was for me as well. But once you experience that, you're like, my God, it's like mind blowing. It's like heartwarming. It's like, it's wonderful. And I think everyone deserves to feel that.
Amen to that. Caroline, where can people find you, and where would you like to direct them if they're seeking any form of help with anything that we've talked about?
Well, the first go-to thing is, of course, my Instagram. That is something. So Caroline Middelsdorf, that is my Instagram account. And from there, I'm very happy and excited. I'm having a small course that's already running and helping a lot of people. It's really for people who want to start their healing journey, who feel so overwhelmed and they don't know where and how to start. I bring there a lot of practical steps, practices, things that they can do. But also in December, I'm launching my real in-depth course that is really, really for how to overcome and do the deep work together. Because there I will be much more involved. That's something that was a heartfelt thing. I want to be more involved in your journey and answer your questions, give that helping hand. And there we work as a community together, which is so important. That connection with others and creating that safe place. And for some people, a place to call home they never had. That's also important.
Beautiful. And I'll be sure to put everything in the show notes. Caroline, it was such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much. Truthfully, I'm glad that we we decided to move the podcast. Thank you once again, and thank you all for listening. And until next week, here's to a sharper life.